Welcome everybody here in the second episode of C.P.E.Bach in Pieces. That's the video series in which I'm going to read together with you C.P.E.Bach's famous book on keyboard playing. I say together with you because I hope you take this journey together with me. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm going to say stupid things, I can promise you. I'm far from a C.P.E.Bach expert, if an expert of anything. Today in the second episode we're going to talk about something very exciting, which is an overview of the editions the book had. You can say that's not exciting at all, but it is, because you can connect it to other aspects as well, as for instance the business-like aspect of C.P.E.Bach. So without further ado, let's dive into that and go directly into what this episode should be about, the editions of the Versuch by Emanuel Bach. So Emanuel's book, Versuch über die wahre Art das Klavier zu spielen, or Treatise on the true art of keyboard playing, consists out of two volumes. Volume 1 is focused roughly, and we're going to discuss detailed content of those books in next episode, but roughly say the first volume is focused around keyboard playing technique and also performance of printed music. Second volume is more on the art of accompaniment, thorough bass and improvisation. So both volumes were edited separate from each other, and the second volume much later. We're going to see that in this episode. So the first volume of the Versuch was announced in as early as 1752, and since Emanuel Bach was a self-publishing artist almost his entire life, I've made an episode on that, I link it here on the screen, he was asking for subscriptions for the book even before it was printed. So, and in 1752 we could read this text, and I bring it up on screen, the original one. I read the translation here from the Packard edition, which says, Treatise on the proper method of playing the keyboard by C.P.E.Bach, a Royal Prussian chamber musician. So then the text goes, the instructive work is planned for publication in Berlin. In it, the author demonstrates the only proper way of fingering and shows by means of certain symbols the ornaments that are to be added while playing, and everything in such a way that an amateur can understand even without private lessons, and can comfortably play pieces by such masters who do not employ these symbols. He also treats all of the characteristics of keyboard instruments, which he illustrates with examples, and adds 6 comprehensive sonatas in which various tonalities, note types, metrical changes, and idiomatic passages are presented along with appropriate ornaments and with fingerings on every note. Everything is so clearly arranged, moreover, that even the most difficult movements can be managed with but little effort and can be played on keyboards not exceeding the usual 4-octave range. Pre-orders for this treatise will be accepted at the 3 Reichsthaler until Michaelmas of this year, with the copies to be delivered by Christmas, after which, however, copies will not be available for under 5 Reichsthaler. So again, Emanuel was a self-publishing author, which means that he had to prepay all the financial costs with the edition. So he had to order the engraving for the work, the printing of the work. He had to organize basically all the advertising and the selling. He had a network of agents that were selling this work for him. Forkel was one of them later on, not in this time already. So it was a kind of huge financial risk, and that he managed to do all his life. So back to the editions, they would come typically in an unbound format. So customers who bought it, if they wanted to make a book out of it, they had to bring the sheets to the bookbinder and make actually a real book out of it. That was how it worked. So now let's dive into an overview of all editions. I take my notes and I bring up screen a very beautiful overview that is given in the Packard edition. I will talk about that edition at the end of this episode. So in 1753, a little bit later than planned, the first part was printed obviously in Berlin, and with the book went the sheets with the ornamentation tables and the 18 Probe-Stücke, 6 sonatas. We're going to discuss that in next episodes, the content of those volumes. The numbers of copies is not known. We're coming back to that at the end of this episode to give an estimation on the numbers of editions that were sold in the 18th century. But it must have been a very successful print though, because in 1759 already a second edition appears of the book itself, and again in Berlin. Some minor changes were made, not too much, and it's interesting to notice that this edition of Book 1, it identifies it, so in 1759, as Volume 1, which means that C.P.E.Bach was thinking clearly of having a second volume, which was about to be printed in 1762. So in that Volume 2 was actually announced as early as 1760 and probably written in 1761. But only 2 years later printed, so 2 years after 1760, in 1762 it was printed. Emanuel Bach, in a late letter of 1785, in fact, wrote about the lazy printer Winter. What's in the name, I would think? Just add an S to that the edition was delayed because that printer Winter would only print if paper would be available. But in fact, we should not forget that that second edition, that second volume, in fact, I should say, was printed at the end of the 7 Years' War, which was really serious matters. It was basically the war between Britain and France. They had a battle on colonies in North America and India, and in fact whole Europe was involved in that. Every major and minor power was involved in that war. So paper was just very rare, and that might have been more proper explanation why the printer was actually delaying the print of that work. And by the way, Volume 2 was 3 times as thick as Volume 1, and probably the printer had not expected it to be so thick. So anyway, interesting to know also, an interesting fact is that in 1762 printers had the ability to print musical notes within the text. So it's a kind of musical typewriting that was just a new technology. Breitkopf refined that later on. So Emanuel was really happy that he did not have to print the musical examples on different sheets, but or incorporate them in the text. I can show you, if you have today's Breitkopf facsimile of Emanuel Bach's book, which is of course a very known edition here. You can see that's the first edition. Hope you can see it, on screen. So that has no notes in the text. There are on a separate piece of paper. I don't know if that's, well, it's here. So that's the edition. But if you look to the second volume, there you have the notes in the text. And of course, this is much easier to read. So after his move to Hamburg in 1768, Emanuel Bach wants to clear a little bit of that pile of stock that he still had and want to sell his rights to a publisher, which was in the whole course of his life a kind of a unique thing, because for his musical scores, except for a few, he was his own publisher, so he kept everything in own hand. But apparently he wanted to free some time, not having to keep on trying to sell his Versuch, which did, by the way, sold very well during the whole 18th century. But he in vain tried to give that to Breitkopf, which was his business partner at the time. So not only his printer, but also his business partner. He had other important people. Forkel was one of them. We should not forget that Forkel really sold a lot of C.P.E.Bach stuff. So, and then he turned to Schwickert, which was a Leipzig printing house that accepted to buy the whole stock that was still present in C.P.E.Bach's house, and not only his stocks, also the rights for both volumes. So for volume 1 and 2. Breitkopf, by the way, regretted that decision later, because he would have liked to edit and publish the work by himself. But it was sold to Schwickert in 1780, and the entire stock, and I'm reading now, consisted of 275 copies of volume 1, 446 copies of volume 2, 50 copies of the supplement to part 1, and 500 copies of the engraved Fantasia, which was the supplement for the free improvisation of part 2. So Schwickert obviously started to sell that pile of stock immediately, and what did he do? He made a new title page so that it appears to be a new edition with his name as an editor and publishing house on the title page. So but basically that was still the old pile of stock that he was selling with a new title page, so really not a new edition. So when Schwickert ran out of stock for the first volume, which was the smallest number he bought from C.P.E.Bach, he started to prepare for then third edition. That would eventually be published in 1787. So Emanuel Bach had promised him in 1780 to add new material to an eventually new edition, but he came back to his promises in 1783 in a letter that's really too interesting not to share with you. I'm reading now that letter from this edition, of a part of it. I've made a video on that, so the letters of C.P.E.Bach, you can click on it if you want to know more about this edition. Really interesting to read. And so that's a letter 18 February 1783. So this is in the midst of preparation for the third edition of the first volume, not the second one, because the second one, Schwickert, had enough copies still to be sold. So Emanuel Bach writes, "You would like an expansion for the new edition? An improvement? The improvement is not possible. The text has been thought through as rigorously as it can be. The expansion can take place if you want." So basically Emanuel Bach ran through the whole first volume and said basically there's nothing to add, which is very important for us to remember, because he approved his own work of 1753, 1752 and as late as 1783. So he said basically there's nothing to add. What he did promise in 1780, and he's talking about that, are actually comments on other works, which he by then, in 1783, find not relevant anymore. So he says, "A week ago I read through calm-headedly and with full attention the comments I voluntarily promised you." So, referring to the 1780 letter. "And upon which you are insisting so much. They were all composed by me with a sarcastic and very irritated quill against 3 of my enemies. All 3 enemies have now gone to sleep," basically they deceased, "without having done great damage to my book. The ungrateful Löhlein had irritated me the most with his Klavierschule. I had done much good for him in Potsdam. I reminded him amicably. He answered me rudely, basta. I certainly aspired to too much. I wanted to be the only teacher and did not consider that other people also want to make a living." And basically they copied parts of his book, so that he didn't like, obviously. "One, a scrawler of compendia, an immature student of mine, remained in the dark, regretting his adventure before his death, and I forgave him. It's uncharitable, a bad trick, and beneath my dignity to use harsh expressions against the deceased, since they can no longer defend themselves," etc., etc. So he withdrew from his early promise to make additions, and those additions were not adding real value, but just were commenting on people who were actually extracting parts from that book and publishing under their own name without mentioning his name. So that, of course, pissed him off. But they were all gone, really died, and so Emanuel Bach said, well, who cares about that? But the content of the first volume is still valid, and that's important. What he did make, though, he made some minor changes, but he also said, and that's important, "I want to make a suggestion to you that I would have carried out myself if the book still belonged to me." So he made a suggestion to Schwickert, the book belonged to Schwickert, and so to change some things. "A large error in the first part must be corrected. The Probe-Stücke," we're going to talk about that in the next episode, but those pieces were added to the first volume as to illustrate the content of the book with fingerings and explanations of ornaments and things like that. "They increase," quote from Emanuel Bach, "too fast in difficulty. At that time, I could not change this in order to treat everything without becoming too long-winded and costly. So I realized this mistake afterwards, basically that his Probe-Stücke, the pieces that went along with this book, even for amateurs, were too difficult. Many people wanted just the text and not the Probe-Stücke, since many of the latter were too difficult for them. So how would it be if I sent you 4, at the most 6 short and easy Probe-Stücke with the fingering and a clean copy, which the instructor can easily arrange among the more difficult ones? And so he did compose 6 new ones that went along with the 1787 new edition, 3rd edition, published by Schwickert. As for the second volume, Schwickert obviously had enough copies still from the previous print in 1787, but although there is not real correspondence left about that, some letters has been lost, and the content of that is only known to us because of summaries in auctionaries where the letters were sold in previous decades or even centuries. So we know that Emanuel Bach also made corrections of the second part. And interesting, in 1797, so a second edition, a real Schwickert edition, then printed by Breitkopf, was printed and so made available, and 10 years, almost 10 years after Emanuel Bach's death, containing the updates from his own hand. There is a copy preserved in the Hamburg Staats- und Universitätslibrary of Emanuel Bach's first volume with annotations by copywriters. It's long time has been assumed that it was all his hand, but it's not true. But there are some additions in his own hand. So at a very high age, which he was in 87, became an old man, in fact. So he added some things. So that's preserved. We don't have that for the second volume, but presumably the 1797 edition is still not being proofread, so not being authorized by Emanuel Bach, but still prepared by the master. We're going to discuss the influence that the book had on other composers in later episodes, but for now, we don't know, or we, the musicologists, don't know real exactly how many copies there were printed and sold. But a rough estimation, and I have to take my paper again, so made also by Mitchell, which is the translator of the English edition, he roughly estimated that there were 2,350 copies sold of volume 1 and 1,440 copies sold of volume 2, and those numbers has been acknowledged, not approved because nobody can know, in the Packard edition, so the most recent one. So that it's really a lot. So the influence of Emanuel Bach's work cannot be underestimated. Also, going to later times, so to Mozart, Beethoven, it still was very valid at the time. Going to talk about Gottlob Tuck in other series. That book was printed in 1789, so 2 years after the 3rd edition of the first volume of C.P.E.Bach. It gets a little bit complicated, but I will bring the beautiful table of the Packard edition again on screen. So, to close this video, which editions am I using now? Obviously the Breitkopf facsimile, which is not too expensive. It's of course written in the typical 18th century letter, so it's hard to read if you're not really reading very well German. This is extra hard, but I think it's not so expensive. You should have this if you're really interested. So it's printed. This is a 1992 edition of the 1958 facsimile made by Lothar Hoffmann Erbrecht. So this edition has been replaced by a new one in 94, which I don't have, and is edited by Wolfgang Horn. Both use the first edition, so 1753 part 1, 1762 part 2, so not the 1787 edition. Important to know. Then you have the English translation by Mitchell, I believe 1949, which still is today the only English translation, I guess. It's a beautiful and very good in-depth preface, and I believe that the translation still is valid today. And then, of course, the state-of-the-art edition. I have here 2, now the 3rd one is here, 3 volumes. So that's obviously Emanuel Bach's Versuch number 1, number 2, and that's the annotation volume. So that's the Packard Institute reprint. They're reprinting all of Bach's works. It's in German, but in modern letter type, and they have also changed a little bit the first edition, including the notes. Obviously, we can do it today with the computer in the text, which makes reading way more easy. So to really close this long episode, but again, I was telling you in the beginning, it's very interesting. Emanuel Bach planned a third volume talking about composition, but he never even started that work. That's a pity. So next episode, we're going to talk about the content of these volumes. What's the work about? If you're interested in staying on top of everything, no better way than to subscribe to the channel. If this is your first time here on Authentic Sound, I'd love to have you subscribe. There is a little bell icon next to the subscription button. Hit that bell icon and you will get notification for new videos. Also for the live streams, which we're doing 4 or 5 a month now, interacting with you. So thank you for watching this extensive episode. Again, I like those type of little researches because they open so much of connections at those time. The people become real people again, and not only names that we just know and know for such a long time. So people of flesh and blood. Thank you for watching, sharing this video with your friends, and we see each other very soon again. Bye.